Hello everyone, this is going to be a YouTube video that is going to help you complete the final FRQ in your 2.6 to 2.9 independent practice. Specifically, this YouTube video is going to talk about governmental interventions in international trade. So we're going to talk about tariffs today and kind of use our supply and demand graph and the concepts of consumer and producer surplus to kind of picture the effects of tariffs on social welfare. Specifically, here's some things that we need to get straight. So tariffs, just a quick definition, are taxes on imports, and quotas are a limit on the number of imports. Okay, let me see if I can delete this little highlighted area. And so specifically, we can imagine a market clearing price. We can imagine a market for hoodies, and we kind of use this example. And then the price, this equilibrium price, this would be the US domestic market for hoodies. And we said, for the sake of learning these concepts, we're going to assume the US, this US market is an autarky. So meaning is not trading, is not engaged in free trade and trade with other countries. And so this is the domestic market we end up with in the United States. And so let's say that it takes about $40. This is an accurate representation of the marginal cost of whatever incremental unit is produced along this supply curve. So we'll say the equilibrium price is $40 and the quantity in this market demanded and supplied, let's just say it's 50,000 hoodies, whatever this type of hoodie is. Okay, so we're assuming the United States is not engaged in free trade. We know what consumer and producer surplus is going to look like here. So let me get a highlighter. Consumer surplus is going to be our producer surplus. I'll highlight producer surplus first because I started highlighting it first. It's going to be located above the supply curve but beneath the equilibrium price. And then consumer surplus is always going to be located beneath the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. Right here. So beneath the demand curve, above the equilibrium price. So that's consumer surplus is in green, producer surplus is in yellow. And we've talked about, what these things mean. They're interesting measures of the social welfare of markets, not necessarily the best measures of the social welfare of leaving the markets to their own devices, but a very important measure nonetheless that can help us frame debates about the efficacy or the efficacy of governmental policies and interventions. So now we're going to see, let's assume that the United States opens up its market to trading with other countries. And so we would expect a lower market price, right? So let's say $8, the world can manufacture hoodies for $8, the world market. This represents the price of the world market, $8 for hoodies. And we talked about in Unit 1 about comparative advantage. We've also talked about how U.S. labor is more heavily compensated than other countries' labor around the world. And U.S. labor, there's this fascinating documentary which I was thinking of showing. I think I've discussed it with some classes, called American Factory, which kind of shows the ways in which American workers seem to be less productive in this documentary than foreign workers. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But if the world price is less for a domestic market, we should expect that, and free trade is allowed, right? Free trade is allowed. We can still show the effects of this of exchange of goods and services, or exchange or this of this opening up the economy on the domestic market. on the US domestic market. So we're going to show those effects. But I will also say if the world price is higher than the domestic price, then that means the United States probably has a comparative advantage in producing that good or service, and we would expect them to export that good and service. But if the world price is lower, we would expect the country whose domestic market is represented here to import that good or service. So like a price floor, a lot of you said, like a price floor, there's a gap between the quantity supplied. This represents the quantity supplied of domestic producers and the quantity demanded of domestic consumers, right? Which we would expect because now effectively the price has moved down to this point, and we said the law of demand says that as the price falls, the quantity demanded increases, and we can represent that here. We can see this as movement along the demand curve to this new point. But as the price falls, we would expect the quantity supplied to decrease. And so the quantity of domestic producers supplying this good or willing to supply this good decreases to this point. But unlike a price floor, because you're engaged in international trade, previously a price floor, we would think of this as a shortage, right? A shortage. But now we can think of this as representing all of the imports, right? Because this Q supplied is the quantity supplied of the domestic market of these types of hoodies, because these producers right here would be willing to supply those goods at that price. And then the rest of these units represents the quantity supplied by the international market, or essentially the imports, right, from this gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded. And then let's see what this does to consumer surplus. Right, so we see consumer surplus, again, is everything beneath the demand curve and above the new price, right? So everything above the price and beneath the demand curve, we see that consumer surplus increases. It increases both at the expense of producer surplus, and it also, we can see it gains in terms of this little triangle right here. So, and we can see that a producer surplus shrunk and is now reduced to this little right triangle in the corner. This is the new producer surplus, right? And what this represents is the price that producers are paying, or the price that producers are receiving, and these represent producers that would have been willing to produce this good at lower price points. There weren't very many of them. But we still have some producer surplus, but it is significantly reduced. Okay, so pretty interesting. We can also see that from this equilibrium quantity supplied by the domestic market, we move to QS. This is going to be the new quantity supplied by the domestic market. Let's say it's 40,000 units. So we should presume that there is going to be a great number of domestic producers and people that are unemployed, because hoodies are going to be manufactured elsewhere more efficiently. So domestic producers really take a big hit from this. Okay, and we can see this and conceptualize this with consumer and producer surplus. We can also see, however, that free trade really does increase the total surplus, right? Because consumer surplus increased, not just at the expense of producer surplus. We also got this whole new area, this whole new triangle, right? This whole new isosceles triangle. Okay. Now I want to show us what effectively a tariff means. So this is what a tariff would do. A tariff, we said, every time we think of governmental policy in free markets, we should always think of it in terms as artificially increasing or decreasing the price in a market, right? That's what governmental intervention does. And this is our expectations of this market. And so I'm just going to show you what we get. Well, now we get an increase of producer surplus with this tariff, and I'll explain how this PT represents the tariff. We get an increase of producer surplus. We get some deadweight loss that comes with artificially altering the equilibrium in this market, or whenever you enter the market and are effective, meaning your governmental intervention actually alters the price at which goods are exchanged, you're going to get deadweight loss. And then we see a receding consumer surplus. Okay. And so this we can think of, we talked about steel tariffs in Unit 1. This can be like the market for steel, or we can still talk about the market for hoodies. And let's kind of conceptualize and look at what the heck happened. Okay, so essentially at PW, we have the new world price. So the original domestic market price is here. We talked about what consumer and producer surplus would look like. At PW, we have the new world price. And so let's say the government wanted to institute a tax on goods that are imported or coming into the country. We said that when we think about taxes, we should think of it as sort of adding on to the price of that good or service, because that's essentially what it is. And so we would conceptualize this as a upward shift of the price, and we would draw the new PT point, which would represent the price with the tariff. And the distance between these 2 points, right, if PT minus PW represents the actual tariff. Right, so maybe the tariff, let's say this is a market for hoodies, so that way we can use the same units from the last one. And we can say maybe this is a $10 tariff. And so before we had a world price at $8, so PT would be $18. And then the original market clearing price for the domestic market would have been $40. Okay. And so with PT, we said that anytime we institute governmental intervention and we alter prices, we're going to end up with deadweight loss. And deadweight loss is symbolized by these little right triangles right here. Right. So we can see that the price went up, and so effectively more domestic suppliers, as we can see, more domestic suppliers are now supplying this good or service, and we can see that are represented in movement from Q1, which was the original domestic suppliers willing to supply at that price point, at that world price point, to Q2. Now there's more domestic suppliers willing to supply at that price point. And then we can also see that there is from Q4 to Q5. Originally, Q5 was the quantity demanded at the world price point, and the quantity supplied is right here at the world price point. And we said that this gap that would exist would be imports. With the tax, however, we're fundamentally altering the incentive structure. So we artificially raise the price of the incentive structure. And because we are taking away this tax revenue, right, we should expect to alter the we're altering, the market is no longer allocatively efficient, so we should expect deadweight loss. Right, and we could see this deadweight loss. The area of this deadweight loss is represented by, predictably, right, this this gap in the tax, so $10, right, and then this gap in, if you actually think about it, this gap between quantity supplied or the new QD. So if we actually multiply the new QD, whatever that new quantity demanded is, by $10 and divide by 2, we should be able to come up with the area of this right triangle, right, and the deadweight loss associated with it. This represents the loss in total surplus that results from instituting or artificially increasing the price. You're always going to get deadweight loss with any governmental intervention that is successful at modifying the price at which a good or service is exchanged, because you're altering the incentive structure that exists within the market, right? You're moving a market away from a point where marginal benefit equaled marginal cost, that maximize total welfare in society, or total social surplus in society, moving it away from that point maybe moving it to a point where marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, or where marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit. And so we should always expect deadweight loss with instances that alter prices. Okay, so if we compared the total surplus of this tariff, or of this, scenario with the total surplus of the previous scenario, we end up being able to see that there is a loss in total surplus, right, because of this tariff. This right here, this rectangle is going to represent governmental revenue, and we can see that it represents governmental revenue because it's a per unit tariff, meaning that for each unit there's a tariff attached to it. And so we would expect, because the formula for revenue equals price times quantity, we expect the price of the tariff, which is denoted from the distance between PT to PW, which is 10, times the quantity of imports, right? Because you're only taxing imports, and that's represented now by this smaller area. This is the new imports from Q2 to Q4. It represents the new imports. You multiply that out. So I'll put from Q4 minus Q2. $10 times Q4 minus Q2 is going to give you the total governmental revenue. The reason why you end up with deadweight loss with taxation is because you altered the incentive structure. You artificially increase the price, and so people or consumers are going to demand less of that good or service, and you're taking away revenue. So you're altering the price at which the sellers receive. So there's a gap between the price that the buyers see and the gap between which the sellers on the international market receive. And so we're always going to end up with deadweight loss, right? Right, and we can conceptualize this deadweight loss as kind of a drop between the we're always going to find deadweight loss by looking at the original price and then the new price, and then looking at the original quantity supplied and the new quantity supplied. That's going to help us locate deadweight loss in this example. And the new quantity demanded and the old quantity demanded, and looking at the old price and the new price, right? That's going to help us locate deadweight loss. They're always represented by these triangles. Okay, I hope this was helpful. This FRQ you can do on your own. Yeah, you can do this one on your own.